everyone and welcome back to another video. My name is Tilly and I'm a strength and conditioning coach with my bachelor's and my master's in exercise and sports science. Today we're going to be talking about something that I think gets mixed up a lot. It gets mixed up in the literature, but also just day to day and online. I see it being thrown around incorrectly. So we're going to clear everything up today. We're going to be talking about overtraining and whether or not it's even real. Spooky. But before we get into it, guys, it would be amazing if you could like and subscribe to help the channel grow, and it'll mean that you get to stay up to date with some really cool sports science discussions. Again, I think they're cool at least. Now let's get started with some basic definitions and concepts. What is overtraining? Overtraining is a long-term decrease or stagnation of performance. It occurs in response to an accumulation of training and non-training stress. This is a really important thing that we're going to have to remember throughout this video, is that overtraining is also associated with non-training stress. So psychological or social issues that might be going on in our life has the ability to send us into that realm of overtraining. We can usually get our performance back, but with overtraining, the restoration of performance could take several months or longer, and it's going to depend on how severe the stressors were to begin with. Now, there's two main types of overtraining. We call them sympathetic overtraining and parasympathetic overtraining. It's often been thought, though not conclusively illustrated, that parasympathetic overtraining is a more severe version of overtraining. I've said it too much now. And this is because the parasympathetic version of overtraining is usually associated with more advanced stages of exhaustion. And it's associated with things like neuroendocrine suppression, so our hormones and everything gets all out of whack. Sympathetic overtraining, on the other hand, is just more indicative of that prolonged stress response. I'm gonna pop up a table just now that showcases some of the symptoms that we get in both versions of the overtraining, but some really interesting ones that are worth highlighting are things like increased instances of depression, irritability, decreased performance, obviously, and then also hormonal issues. So you can see it's not just the performance that's affected, it's also our mood and our ability to function and cope with everyday life. There's a lot of theories on how overtraining can be caused, and like I've mentioned throughout this video so far, we think generally that it can be caused by both physiological and psychological stressors. Within strength and conditioning practices, or how we train in the gym or on the field, overtraining is usually caused by monotonous training program design or chronic overwork. This either means that we're doing the same thing over and over again with no variation in intensity or volume, or it means that we're pushing ourselves really hard for way too long and without the appropriate recovery practices in place. Now, the reason why I posed the question at the start as to whether or not overtraining is actually real, it's because so much of the literature on the actual subject is about something called overreaching, not overtraining. Now, what is overreaching? Well, unlike overtraining, overreaching is the short-term reduction in performance capacity. It's also called concentrated loading, and it is a result of the planned accumulation of training and non-training stress. The restoration of performance in regards to overreaching could be several days, or it could be weeks as well. It's going to depend on the actual magnitude of the stressors that we had to begin with. So how big was the stress? What's really important is that these periods of overreaching should be planned. They should not be a surprise. And following this planned period of large volume or intensity, we should have a period in which the volume or intensity is reduced, or a deload period. Now, there's two main forms of overreaching. We call them functional and non-functional overreaching. Functional overreaching is where we get those temporary reductions in performance, and usually our performance will super compensate, or it'll increase over the next few days or few weeks after that overreaching block or session. So the training adaptations that we make with this are delayed. With non-functional overreaching, this is where we either get no changes or decreases in performance. And our performance can take weeks to months to return to baseline. So that non-functional overreaching is associated with training plateaus and things like that. It's where we're kind of slipping into that realm of overtraining. Here's a diagram from a textbook by Bompa and Haff, and it shows how all of these different types of overtraining or overreaching interact with each other on a continuum. So feel free to pause that if you want to understand in a little bit more detail what each of those aspects are. Now, like I said, a lot of the literature actually confuses that overtraining with overreaching, but the two are not the same thing. It's also really unethical to put people into states of overtraining, and so a lot of that overtraining research is actually overreaching because ethically we just can't do it. Now, having shown some of the symptoms to you and having explained a little bit about the differences between each, you might be thinking, okay, well, that's great, but how do we avoid slipping into those stages of overtraining or overreaching, and how do we avoid getting decreases in our performance? And the answer is you don't. There's a lot of times where you don't want to avoid overreaching. We know from other theories in exercise science, like the general adaptive syndrome, which I explain in another video, that our bodies only adapt when they're exposed to a stimuli to the quality or intensity of which they're not yet adapted. So we have to do something we're not used to and that's challenging to us in order to make improvements. On that note, it's believed that loading schemes associated with overreaching can actually contribute and create really significant performance gains. So we have to do it. We need those periods of concentrated loading or overreaching to get adaptation. I've got another really cool graph here for you, and you can see how our performance changes between a typical training session and a functional overreaching session. Now look at that supercompensation response, and that just means look at that response or increase in performance. Look at how much higher they are when we really push ourselves. And of course, when our periods of training are followed by appropriate recovery. How long we need to recover afterwards, again, is dictated by how long that concentrated loading pattern was done for and how big the loads were that were placed on us. The greater the length of concentrated or intense loading, the longer time needed for us to see those gains in performance. But they might be a bit bigger, so it's worth the wait. Now, how do we do this safely? Because obviously when we're challenging ourselves or we're trying to induce some aspect of overreaching or overtraining, there's going to be some risks associated with that. Firstly, we need to plan out when we're going to overreach ourselves or our athletes. We need to be clever. For example, if I know somebody's got exams coming up, I'm probably not going to set that as a really difficult week for them because those psychological and social life stressors contribute to how we recover in the gym or recover from our field sessions. We also generally want about 5 to 10% increases in load from week to week. That's just general rule of thumb, and that helps us to reduce injury risk. When we overreach, we're generally increasing our training load from 10 to 30% at a time. Now that's huge, right? If you have a look at this graph, you can see that the 10 to 30%, that's a massive difference in our injury risk, right? It's much higher, but we need to do it, right? We absolutely need to do it. But we can mitigate this risk by checking in with ourselves and monitoring ourselves to ensure that we are recovering appropriately. So what I mean by this is, are you sleeping enough? Are you on your feet all day and you're having to be really active? If yes, then maybe we should aim for a smaller percentage increase in our training load for that overreaching week. Are you eating enough? Are you consuming more calories than you're burning? If you're eating less calories than you're burning, so you're not getting enough fuel in, then you might really struggle to keep up with that overreaching week, let alone your everyday training. You could even fail to recover as needed. There's also been some interesting overtraining research that suggests that increasing your carbohydrate content would mean that you're more able to reduce the instances of overtraining or overreaching. Although nutrition obviously isn't the only factor that contributes. We've also got things, like I said, like our sleep, like our social stressors. Did you break up with somebody? Everything contributes. So if you're training really hard and you want to periodize a section of your workouts where you're increasing or pushing yourself to that overreaching phase, then you need to make sure you plan a deload week or something afterwards. You got to make sure you're taking care of yourself. And of course, as I mentioned in those basic training principles video, you have to make sure that you've got some aspect of variation in your training program. So switch up your program every 4 to 6 weeks. Change your training goals. Switch up your exercises. Just do not do the same thing at the same intensity continuously. Just don't do it, okay? Now, the final thing that I wanted to mention is something that's been up for discussion in the literature, and it was a discussion point in my master's degree cohort. It's something that I would love your opinion on. Can beginners overtrain? The current idea that I subscribe to is that no, they can't, because beginners simply don't have the capacity to reach the high intensities or high volumes of training continuously. They can train super hard or as hard as they can, and they might overdo it, but this would be more of an overload injury. And an overload injury is just simply the result of improper loading. It's not the accumulation of psychological and physiological stressors, both training and non-training related, that could result in months to years of decreased performance capacity. So what do you guys think? I'd love to hear what you think down below. And if you have any questions about anything that I covered in today's video, I'd also love to know down below. That is it from me, guys. I hope you learned something, or I hope I exposed you to some new stuff. As always, all of the references are down below. I highly recommend that you check them out if you're wanting to learn a little bit more about overtraining. If you guys could like and subscribe, it would be wonderful to have you be a part of this little community. I'd love to know more about how you program for yourself, and do you plan sections of that overtraining overreaching in your training sessions? Let me know down below, guys. I'll see you next time. Have an amazing week. Ciao, amici.